Hi, this is Ethan Cannaert and Zach Colton, and today we'll be discussing three of what we believe to be quintessential dishes to traditional Japanese cuisine: miso soup, gyoza, and sake. While we are discussing the historical significance and history of these dishes, we will also be showing how miso soup and gyoza would be prepared nowadays.
The first Japanese cuisine that we will be making is miso soup. The ingredients used in the miso soup we are making are 4 cups of water, 3 tablespoons of miso paste, 1 package of silken tofu diced, and 2 green onions sliced diagonally. Most miso soups will also include dashi granules, but we were unable to find the ingredient. More American dishes will often substitute in a vegetable or chicken stock as a form of local adaptation. Especially before Asian food markets started showing up in the United States, dashi would not be easy to obtain, and even now we were unable to find it for our recipe. Although the taste will be slightly different, these alternative stocks still offer lots of flavor.
The traditional meal in Japan is called ichiju isai, meaning a combination of a bowl of soup, rice, and side dish. Miso soup is often seen as a staple bowl of soup involved in this meal. The first recorded consumption of this soup was around the 10th century. As miso soup was seen as a delicacy, it was not often that you would see common people enjoying it. Instead, it was enjoyed more as a side dish during dinner or lunch. In order to fully understand why the soup became such a large part of the cultural matrix in Japan, one must first look at the ingredients needed to make it.
To begin the cooking process, one heats up dashi granules and water in a pot, bringing the combination to a boil. Dashi granules are a stock specifically used for miso soup. It is often made with dried sardines, smoked bonito or tuna, shiitake, and kelp. Since we could not find dashi, we decided to forego adding any additional broth and see what would turn out if we simply left this ingredient out of the recipe.
Next, after bringing the water down to medium heat, miso paste is whisked into the pot. Miso paste is made from mixing soybeans with salt and a fermenting agent called koji. Soy, the main ingredient in miso paste, was originally used during the Han Dynasty in China before moving to Japan and Korea. Over time, miso and soy sauce, both originating from soy, started to diverge. By the 18th century, soy sauce was almost exclusively used as a seasoning for foods, whereas miso was exclusively used for soup. By the 1950s, it was much more common to find miso farmers than soy farmers, as it yielded a much larger crop, and more of the crop was used in the miso making process. As the name would suggest, miso paste is the essential ingredient in miso soup, giving it that authentic taste people have come to know and love.
The next step in the cooking process is to stir in the tofu. Along with miso paste, tofu is made from soybeans. Like wheat meat, or as it is more commonly known by the loanword seitan, tofu is a meat substitute that is very wide variety of dishes. While many Chinese like to believe that tofu was invented by a Han Dynasty prince 2,000 years ago, the written character showed up in the language around 900 CE, and therefore it is more likely that the food was invented around the 9th century. While the older method of making tofu involved days and nights of soaking and crushing beans, newer methods involve a much simpler process of soaking soybeans overnight, grinding them, and finally mixing with water and boiling for a short amount of time. In older Buddhist, Christian, and Islamic cuisines, it was actually one of the 3 principles, the sacrificial bargain, to replace certain ingredients in dishes, one of which was to substitute fake meat such as tofu for dishes including meat. The reason for cultural adaptation varied from religion to religion. In Buddhism, it was believed that Buddha died after eating pork. As a result, some meats were banned from being eaten, while those that were allowed could not be eaten in front of the consumer. The consumer could not hear the animal being killed, and the animal could not have been killed specifically for the consumer.
Finally, the green onions are added to the soup and allowed to simmer for a little while. In Japan, green onions are actually cultivated in one of 2 ways. Either with most of the onion being green, or having the stalk buried most of the way so it remains white. Green onions are very popular in many Japanese cuisines, such as hot pots and stir fries, as well as miso soup.
Next, we move on to making gyoza. These Japanese dumplings consist of a shell of flour and water, and a filling made of pork, cabbage, and shiitake mushrooms.
Broadly speaking, dumplings are any dish consisting of dough shells surrounding some sort of filling. Most commonly, these dough shells will consist of a paste of wheat flour that Westerners usually think of as filled pasta. There are countless different forms of dumplings that have been changed to appeal to the cultural matrix of the cultures that have adopted them. While local adaptation may have changed the ingredients, style, and taste, there remains a strong family resemblance among these different types of dumplings.
Historical and linguistic evidence suggests that dumplings originate from northwest China from the Turkic people somewhere around 300 AD. The original Chinese word for dumplings was mantu, which many scholars believe is a loanword derived from the Turkish manti. In fact, the name for dumplings in many languages are closely related to this word, such as mandu from Korea or momo from Mongolia and Tibet. Dumplings are first mentioned in the literature in China in Shuqi Ode Bing. The dish known as gyoza first became popular in Japan after soldiers returned to Japan from China with Chinese dumplings or zhoji recipes. The word gyoza comes from the Jilu Mandarin reading of zhoji. Overall, gyoza shows rich layered influence that tells much about the history of the dish.
Many recipes for gyoza call for vegetarian fillings, which could be the result of Buddhist influence in Japan. Buddhist beliefs tend to frown upon eating meat, and the rise of Buddhism in Japan in the 1st century popularized Buddhist-inspired food customs that steered away from meat.
Dumpling shell of gyoza is made of a simple mixture of water and flour dough kneaded and flattened into wrappers. Whereas Eastern Asia and Japan are dominated by rice as the dietary staple, the area of Western China and the Middle East where dumplings are said to have originated from relies heavily on wheat, and hence we see the inclusion of flour dough in gyoza unchanged. Chinese zhoji can be steamed, boiled, or pan-fried, but the most common cooking technique for gyoza is to pan-fry one side in oil, and then add water to the oil to steam the rest of the gyoza. We employed this technique in making our own gyoza.
Furthermore, other prohibitions in the 8th century all but ended the consumption of meat in Japan. During the 15th century, however, Catholic missionaries had visited Japan and encouraged the consumption of meat, a practice that would continue even after the Iberian Purge in Japan in the 17th century. Our gyoza is made using ground pork, which follows the food practices in Japan after this Iberian ban. Pork has been a traditional staple of Japanese cuisine for thousands of years, and in the modern day, more pork is consumed in Japan than chicken and beef combined. The inclusion of pork in this dish is an example of local adaptation of dumplings. It goes to show that dumplings were not incorporated into Japanese culture from the Turkic people via wholesale imposition.
The next ingredient added to the filling is minced cabbage. Cabbage is thought to have been domesticated in Europe somewhere around the 1st millennia BC. It was eventually moved to Mesopotamia and the Middle East, where it was grown during the winter, while other local crops could not be grown. Eventually, this was transported through the many trade routes in Asia to China and Japan. Linguistic evidence implies that the introduction of cabbage to China and South Asia happened relatively recently and may not have been introduced in Japan until well into the 18th century AD.
The last ingredient in the filling is chopped shiitake mushroom. Shiitake mushrooms originated in Eastern Asia and are first mentioned to have been cultivated sometime after the 1st millennia AD. While they were present in many Asian cultures, they are most prominent in Japan and China, where they were used for both food and medicinal purposes. In particular, this provides an example of Japanese influence on these dumplings. Sake is made using Japanese white rice koji, rice yeast, and filtered or bottled water. First, the rice and water are mixed, washing the rice several times over. Next, the rice is cooled for 10 minutes and moved to the container that will be used to brew the sake. Koji and yeast are immediately added. The container is then sealed. Throughout the fermentation process, stirring should occur every day or two. After the allotted amount of time, the mixture is strained and the liquid left over is your sake.
The origin of sake is thought to be around 500 BC in China. Farmers back then would gather to chew rice and nuts and would then spit the contents into a container to be fermented. This was until the discovery of koji, a fermented agent mentioned above, because this also was used for the purpose of fermenting soybeans. This technique moved throughout Japan during the Nara period, leading to the wholesale imposition of sake in Japan as we know it today.
The key ingredient to sake is the rice. Rice, as most are well familiar with, is a cultural staple for many Asian countries. It is used in many foods from sushi and wine in Japan to being eaten as a side to braised pork in China, all the way to biryani in India. The history of rice is interesting as it is a pretty widespread crop. The latest dating that can be made was back in 2500 BC in areas in China and surrounding countries. Through both the Indian Ocean trade route and missions taken by people from European countries, rice began to spread throughout Europe. Rice was also exchanged throughout the Columbian Exchange, bringing it to the New World. Alright, thanks very much for watching our video. We learned a lot of stuff from making all these foods and from this class in general.
ありがとうございます。